think if we look deep enough, you'd find a lot of good things going on within the prison system.
They're not reforming them at all. All it is just incarceration. It doesn't teach them any lessons.
Where they're not dealing with what people need, and they're just dealing with punishment rather than reforming.
I think it's a little bit better in Canada than the United States, but I still think that they don't do a lot in terms of the idea of rehabilitating people.
Most people in prison are in prison for drug addiction, mental illness. What does prison do for that?
So some thoughts there from Albertans on how effective provincial prison jails are when it comes to reforming inmates. Gentlemen, are correctional facilities in our province turning out reformed prisoners? Chris, we'll start with you.
Well, you had a couple comments there, one from a young woman and a young gentleman there talking about punishment models. I wanted to speak briefly about that. When we have tough on crime policies, it's really based on punishment, and punishment is based on deterrence theory, if you will. Deterrence theory suggests that if you have swiftness of punishment, certainty of punishment, and severe enough, not too severe, but severe enough, if you have all three of those working in unison, you can have a model based on punishment. But nowhere in our history have we ever had certainty of punishment. You're never certain that you'll be arrested, you're never certain that you'll be charged and then prosecuted, sentenced, and punished. Nor do we have swiftness of punishment. If you are caught, you might get a court date 8 months later and not figure out why you're there in the first place, or what you've done to be in court later on. So this model of deterrence based on punishment just doesn't work, and the research supports that. But my second comment, I think, toward that, and it kind of tags onto the punishment line, is at a federal level anyway, we're spending 2 to 3% of our budget on rehabilitation and reintegration. So I question where our priorities are, quite frankly. If you're going to spend 2 to 3%, what outcomes do you think you're going to get?
Keith, are we sending out folks reformed?
Well, I don't really think so, and that's partly because we're asking correctional workers to do impossible jobs, and that is, you've got an unmotivated kind of clientele. It's like the sweat hogs in the back row of a classroom somewhere. They're not highly motivated, most of them. And if they are motivated, there's a kind of inmate code that says, listen, if you're too cooperative, if you're fired up, if you start taking programs, you're making the rest of us look bad. And it really puts a damper on the inmate who might want to better himself. And again, we just don't have them in the provincial institutions long enough to do much for them. And at Fort Saskatchewan, which is a relatively new modern institution with an area for auto body and bricklaying and carpentry, those programs aren't even really operating now because the inmates are in and out of that place so fast that they never get a chance to complete anything, even if they are motivated. But the big issue I find is just unmotivated inmates who are bound by this idea that you don't cooperate, you don't show too much enthusiasm, you don't really buy in to the program, and as a consequence, it leaves the people working, trying to do something, very frustrated. You do get exceptions, but on the whole, it's an extremely, extremely difficult job.
Chris, is it not mandatory that a prisoner has to go through some form of rehabilitation,
well,
or is it, as Keith says, there's a motivation factor there?
Not necessarily. I think Keith's dead on that. It's a tough clientele. The trouble with the programming, though, is, in my mind, again, bringing back the 2 to 3% of your budget is going to that. The other 98% is going to guards and bars and doors and locks and that type of thing. So we've got an issue there. I think Keith's right in the sense of there's a bit of a time issue. I think there might be ways to work around that. But another issue with our programming I think we have is mandatory or not mandatory is the programming is often dealt with the incident for which they're there. So if you commit an assault, well, maybe 2 years later when you're finally in prison or whatever the case may be, you might get anger management programming. Well, that's fine, but it's dealing with the particular incident for which you are there now. It's not dealing with all of the other risk factors associated with recidivism when we release you, which probably or may not be anger. It might be poverty, low education, no housing, no job. And I could go on and on because there's dozens of risk factors. And so we don't really get at that very well.
That makes it sound then like a life of crime creates a life behind bars in a sense, and a revolving door. People just keep coming back.
It is a revolving door, and I could say this: if we could get rid of drugs and alcohol, we'd be all out of business, because the vast majority of offenders are drug and alcohol related, and or have mental illness problems. Now, the province is basically using our correctional institutions to treat mental health, not treat them, that's a too kind of word, to house mental health kinds of cases. So these guys are in and out and in and out. They're back in the streets. They're either victimized or they're victimizers. They're back in again. Hardly ever that you open up a new file. It's the same guys over and over again. We have a mental health unit at Fort Saskatchewan. It's full to the brim, and it's all people who ideally would be housed in somewhere like Alberta Hospital, getting proper treatment. But because it's cheaper to house them as inmates in the correctional system than as patients in the mental health system, we have them in these jails. So they get stigmatized. You're mentally ill, you got a criminal record, and you're in there at risk from the general population, because other inmates are very predatory, and you got tics, you talk to yourself, you're going to get whacked. And so you're trying to house them there for their own protection. We're using most of our energy protecting inmates from each other, not in fancy treatment programs and all of that kind of thing. It's frustrating.
And Keith is exactly right with those points. And I was actually speaking recently to an occupational therapist. What they've done now, corrections, is making a real concerted effort here. And I'm quite proud of the Alberta government for the strides they're trying to make. The trouble is, and I don't blame them for this, but the trouble is we tend to do 1,000 things 10% of the way and don't really have a focus. So we recognize the mental health issues in the prisons. So we thought, well, we better bring in some occupational therapists who deal with mental health issues into the system until we can figure out, you know, a different way to run our business, so to speak. You know, but when I was speaking with her, she indicated, you know, I'm alone. Due to security issues and this and that, I only get about 3 hours a day to work with these folks, or 4 hours a day, you know, this type of thing. And God forbid there's a shutdown. If there's a shutdown because of an incident, I don't work for a week and a half with anyone. And I said, realistically, then how many people do you think you're helping in a very large institution? And she said, in a year, unfortunately, maybe I could count them on 1 or 2 hands. So again, at my point of, I'm proud that corrections and Alberta government, various other organizations are recognizing that there's an issue. But we spread ourselves so thin, and we try to apply programming and this and that, and, you know, to everyone, but we end up doing 1,000 things 10% of the way and not actually making a concerted effort at anything.
Gentlemen, I thank you both for your thoughts tonight.
Glad to be here.
Thank you.
That's retired criminologist Keith Spencer. Chris Hay is Executive Director with the John Howard Society.